Bom dia a todos. É um prazer imenso abrir oficialmente esse workshop internacional do Instituto Ermínia Sant'Ana em parceria com a Copel. Antes de mais nada, eu gostaria de agradecer a pontualidade de todo mundo. Estamos impressionados aqui com a pontualidade britânica de todos. Muito obrigada. É importante dizer que essa é a terceira edição do evento, desse evento internacional. Em 2011, nós tivemos a presença do professor Vlahos, da Universidade do Colorado, Vlahos, que também é futurista, e no ano passado, né, em 2012, o Domênico de Masi, brilhante Domênico de Masi, quem teve a oportunidade de conhecê-lo, de participar aqui, nós fomos brindados com a presença dele. Ele, inclusive, está nos acompanhando nessa transmissão via internet, pelo streaming, então, saudações. Professor Domênico, speriamo di averti qua molto, molto presto tra noi. E nesse ano temos a honra de receber o professor Peter Bishop, da Universidade de Houston. Ele é coordenador dos estudos sobre futuro e antecipação de cenários. Também é consultor de diversas empresas nessa área de futurologia, né? Entre essas empresas NASA, IBM, Nestlé, Tetra Pak, e será o comandante do nosso voo nesses 2 dias de curso. Welcome back to Curitiba, Dr. Bishop.
Yes.
As empresas presentes nesse evento são Copel, Sercompel, Volvo, Itaipu, Momento Ambiental, Sulzer, GRPcom, Itambé, PUC, FAI e Kent University. Hoje à tarde nós também teremos a presença do cônsul-geral dos Estados Unidos, aqui em São Paulo, Dennis Hankins. Ele fará uma visita à Kent University, que inclusive está baseada aqui no Instituto Ermínia Sant'Ana, a Casa de Ideias, né, Rui? A palestra de abertura, na sequência, e também a de encerramento, amanhã às 3h30 da tarde, será transmitida via streaming, por isso que vocês estão acompanhando todo esse equipamento aqui, essa transmissão. E quem não teve a oportunidade de estar aqui presente pode também mandar perguntas via chat, né, por esse streaming que é gratuito. No final de hoje a gente vai selecionar algumas dessas perguntas para o Peter responder, então as pessoas podem mandar tanto em inglês quanto em português essas perguntas. As exposições do professor Bishop serão feitas em inglês, os trabalhos em grupo, obviamente, podem ser feitos em português. Perdão. E as perguntas ao professor Bishop podem ser feitas em inglês e em português. Nós teremos aqui a Annelise, né, Annelise? Ela é diretora do escritório brasileiro da Kent University e vai estar auxiliando a gente nessa transmissão, nessa tradução com o professor Bishop. Em relação ao nosso workshop, que hoje e amanhã vai até às 5 da tarde, o professor Bishop vai apresentar todos os detalhes de intervalos e tudo mais. O almoço, hoje e amanhã, será servido aqui no Instituto mesmo. E todo o material que vocês receberam aí também vai estar disponível na internet. Então, caso vocês prefiram nessa plataforma virtual, vocês vão receber o link aí para baixar esse conteúdo. Agora eu convido o nosso anfitrião aqui da casa, o dono da casa, Rui Sant'Ana, para algumas palavras e desejo a todos um evento fora de série.
Muito obrigado, Aline. Não é qualquer um que pode ser apresentado pela Aline, né? É um privilégio. Rapidamente, palavras de boas-vindas a vocês todos. No início dos anos 80, eu fui aluno do professor Erminia Sant'Ana, lá na Colorado State University. E o professor Vlahos tinha uma matéria chamada Technology Assessment and Social Forecasting. E o professor Vlahos, então, alertava os seus alunos, a maioria deles engenheiros, sobre a importância de antecipar as consequências dos nossos projetos. Não somente na questão ambiental, né, que na época já era muito puxada nos Estados Unidos, mas de uma maneira muito mais abrangente, movimentação de pessoas, aumento de criminalidade, enfim. E eu fiquei encantado por esses assuntos de estudos do futuro e o professor Vlahos nos ensinava uma coisa que nós temos assistido aqui nos nossos escritos, que é impossível prever o futuro. Né? Ninguém sabe o que vai acontecer, mas nós temos a obrigação de antecipar o que pode acontecer. Então essa é a espinha dorsal aqui dessa nossa conversa de 2 dias, né? Nós estamos reunidos aqui hoje graças ao trabalho, à dedicação, ao esforço de muitas pessoas e empresas também. Então, o meu primeiro agradecimento a todos vocês. A Copel foi a nossa parceira de primeira hora. Vamos conversar lá com a Copel, e a Copel imediatamente entendeu a importância de um encontro como esse, que não é novidade. Na década de 80, a Copel já trouxe o Herman Glass. Em 1988, para vocês terem uma ideia, nós fizemos um seminário na Copel chamado The Future of Management, em English, veja só. Então, eu sempre tive muito orgulho, né, em estar ligado com a Copel. Doutor Zimmer, por favor, um abraço lá para os nossos amigos da Copel. É um privilégio. Eu vou novamente contar a história, toda vez que eu estou em público com o meu querido Dr. Zimmer, que apresenta a Copel, contar a história como nós começamos a trabalhar juntos. Eu tive o privilégio de ser assistente do Lindolfo durante alguns anos. Eu era superintendente de uma área de pesquisa da Copel, era uma quarta-feira. O Lindolfo era diretor de marketing. Bate o telefone, eu atendo o telefone, já nos conhecíamos, pessoalmente. Bate o telefone, ele diz assim: Rui, eu vou direto ao assunto, sem muitas delongas. Você não quer vir trabalhar comigo? Uma quarta-feira. Eu disse: quando, Lindolfo? Ele disse: segunda-feira. Veja que eu estava mudando de área, para mudar de área. Que horas, Lindolfo? 8 horas. Eu digo: eu topo. E aí a gente começou uma relação. O pessoal lá do Beck está me corrigindo aqui. Doutor Lindolfo, obrigado pela sua participação. Falando em Copel, não podemos deixar de celebrar a visita de Togomidi, uma das pessoas que mais me influenciou na minha vida profissional e pessoal. Eu tive o privilégio de ser assistente do Togomidi em 2 locais, na Universidade Federal do Paraná e na Copel. O Togomidi também foi presidente da Copel, da Itaipu, da Excelsa, foi ministro das Minas e Energia no tempo do Fernando Henrique Cardoso, e agora estamos envolvidos num projeto muito mais desafiador, né, doutor Togomidi, que todos esses projetos. Nós estamos criando um partido político. E o Peter disse: mas, puxa, vocês não têm partidos políticos no Brasil? O meu querido amigo Lauro Viana disse: não temos. Não temos. Aí aqui eu faço também um gancho para o Lauro, amigo de tanto tempo, né? Agradeço também muito o pessoal da Live One. Esse é um experimento novo para nós. Está transmitindo isso para todo o sistema solar. Afinal de contas, qualquer pessoa... Até dizem que o pessoal da Estação Espacial está nos acompanhando aí, mas isso né? Agradecer. Eu não tinha ideia do trabalho que dá uma transmissão dessa. Eles ficaram ontem, mais ou menos, o dia inteiro para preparar. Eu achei que fosse uma coisa muito mais fácil. E, graças à parceria novamente com a Copel e com a Sercontel, nós estamos aqui com a fibra ótica da Copel, o que permite essa transmissão em alta definição. Eu quero também apresentar aqui a Rosa Alegria. Rosa Alegria é uma das coordenadoras do NEF. NEF é um Núcleo de Estudos do Futuro da PUC de São Paulo. Ela está envolvida também com um projeto das Nações Unidas muito importante nesse contexto do futuro, que é o projeto do Millennium, Millennium Project. E a Rosa já é muito conhecida aqui em Curitiba, consultora já há muito tempo, tem vindo para cá, mas não tinha vindo ainda ao Instituto, Rosa. Então, seja bem-vinda, vai estar conosco aí o tempo todo, né? Annelise Hoffmann hoje representa no Brasil a Kent University. Esse programa Ciências Sem Fronteiras tem possibilitado que muitos brasileiros possam estudar no exterior. E a Kent University é uma das universidades que tem recebido muitos estudantes brasileiros. E nós estamos, por um tempo, né, Annelise, aqui no Instituto, né? O que mais que eu queria comentar com vocês? Eu acho que era isso. Não quero me alongar. Quero, naturalmente, mandar um abraço para os nossos amigos lá em Roma, o S3 Studio, que é o escritório, enfim, do professor De Masi. Tem feito muitos trabalhos na área de futuro também. O professor De Masi tem usado muito a metodologia Delphi, ou Delphi, como os americanos dizem, que é uma das coisas que nós vamos conversar aqui com uma forma de prospectar o futuro. O Demasi e a sua equipe têm feito diversos projetos com o título do 2020, né? Então, futuro da energia, até passei para o Lindolfo um tempo atrás o resultado do trabalho deles, né? Futuro dos recursos humanos, até tivemos aqui no Instituto também o Stefano Palumbo, que é o assistente do Demasi, falando sobre os resultados, né? Nós temos nossos amigos lá no MIT, em Boston, que também estão nos acompanhando. Nós temos nossos amigos na Austrália, meus filhos, no caso. E sem mais delongas, pessoal, sejam bem-vindos, é um privilégio muito grande. Vocês não têm ideia do meu prazer, né? Eu que praticamente nasci nesse lugar aqui. Vocês estão nos ajudando a realizar um sonho de fazer desse lugar uma embaixada do que está acontecendo de melhor no mundo, em termos das melhores universidades, nos melhores centros de pesquisa. And of course, thank you, Professor Bishop. I met Professor Bishop through the World Future Society. Professor Bishop is a well-renowned professor and consultant. Thank you so much for coming to Curitiba, and especially to our institute. Even though it's impossible to predict what's going to happen, I'm going to tell you that after these 2 days, we'll all be different. Thanks to your insights, to your words, to your lectures, and of course, thanks to the insights and questions of these people here. I guarantee that you have the best of Curitiba in this room here.
Agree.
Okay?
Wonderful.
Então, amigos, muito obrigado. Oi? Tudo bem? Então, por favor.
Yes. Well, it is a lovely and it's a great privilege, let me say, to be here today. The most success for a college professor is to be hired by one of his students. And one is successful and as renowned as Rui. It is great that we have put this together, and I really want to appreciate the fact that you've all come out here today. I believe today is an historic day in Curitiba, maybe even all of Brazil, because they tell me this may be the only time that a seminar began on time in Brazil. So I want to thank you also for that. I feel honored that everyone showed up on time and we can get started. So it's wonderful. So I have almost no idea what has been said so far. So I begin with a great naivete. It is a privilege to come and talk to you about strategic foresight. I have been teaching this subject at the University of Houston for 30 years now. I know I don't look that old. I began when I was 5 years old. It has been a privilege of a lifetime to be able to participate in this. They tell me in school for teachers that I have about 10 minutes of your attention before you start thinking about lunch. So I'll use my 10 minutes before I get to the formal presentation to kind of set the context for where we are. One of the most famous essays, my degree is in sociology, and a famous sociologist from the 1950s, C. Wright Mills, who wrote a very famous book called The Power Elite during that time. You may have read that in school. Gave an essay called The Sociological Imagination. And I love the way he put the purpose of a sociologist, and I would say most social scientists, is to connect people's lives to the society in which they lived. The way he actually put it was to connect private troubles to public issues. That we are all part of a gigantic society, and what we read about and what we study about in the news and in school has an effect on our lives, our families, our communities, our businesses, our churches, our communities. And so to point that out, that we're not just alone, we're connected in this gigantic societal complex. Well, I would like to paraphrase that for a futurist, which I am, a professional futurist. And our job is to connect ourselves with history. We are history. We are the history that our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren will read about. We are the turn of the century generation. We are the internet generation. Just like my father's generation was the Depression and the World War II generation, and my children will be the millennial generation. We are a generation. We are an episode in history. And what we do and what we do not do will be celebrated or it will be criticized by generations and generations and generations yet to come. So we always think of history as ending with the present. Our classes in history, even if they get to the present, most of them don't even get that far, but if they get to the present, they stop. And we don't really think of ourselves as part of a continuous flow because, as I discussed yesterday with some very serious people in Sao Paulo at Fiesp, that we do not teach about the future in our schools. So what we know about change is all past. We don't know about change into the future. So this field of strategic foresight is an attempt to correct that, to give us not just the, what shall I say, the intuition about the future, because we all think about the future, we all plan for the future, but even to give us a systematic method for doing so. And that is what this field is offering to the world today and to this seminar here in Curitiba. We are going to be thinking of the future as historians think of the past, as scientists think of their discipline, as social scientists think about their society or the politics or the culture. We're going to do so in a very systematic and useful and productive way. So what really happens at this point in history is, why should this happen now, is my question. Why in 2013, in this moment in history? Well, I like to answer that question with a look back at the creation of another intellectual discipline, and that is the discipline of the studies of the past, history. When did history begin as a study? It began about 2,500 years ago. We know where the beginning was. In the Greek civilization, there were two gentlemen during the height of that civilization who wrote about the past in a brand new way. It was revolutionary thinking. One of those was more actually an anthropologist than a historian. His name was Herodotus. And he traveled around the Mediterranean. He went to Egypt, and he went to Syria, he went to Malta, he went to all of the places around Macedonia and Persia. And he described the people as he found them. What had people done before? They had created myths, they had created legends, they had created fanciful stories to give moral lessons. But he said, no, you go to Egypt, this is what they do, this is what I saw. He was an observer for the very first time in history. Thucydides was a general for the Athenian side in the Peloponnesian War. He lost that war, but he decided to write a book about it anyway. Sounds very much like the White House, after you leave, and you go and write the book. But again, he wrote a revolutionary book because history to that point, from Homer and all of the writers, was all about the legends, was all about the gods and the magic, and we've read the Iliad and the Odyssey and all of that. Well, all of that was somewhat, it's what today we call historical fiction. So if someone writes a book about the previous period and they put characters in that book, it's history, but it's also fiction. So it's both. And he decided to leave out the fiction. He decided to write a book that was his experience of what he saw day by day as a general in that war. And in that process, those two gentlemen created a new way of thinking about the past. So I'm going to say that in these times, in our generation, we are creating a new way to think about the future. We are going to think about the future not as a set of hopes and fears and imaginative constructions or very, very tight data analysis. We're going to combine all of those into a study that gives us not a prediction, but greater confidence that we know what to do and how to navigate these waters of the future. So, the Herodotus and Thucydides were children of their time. They were children of their time because during that time, the whole concept of science was also being born. People were studying forces. Euclid was around that time and invented geometry as we know it. And Pythagoras invented the Pythagorean theorem and a lot of mathematics. So there's a lot of great scientific minds, and they said, why can't we do that for history? So why strategic foresight in our time? Well, the key is something actually which a gentleman yesterday in our talk shared with us, and that is the increasing amount of information which is driving an increasing rate of change in the world today. When I first started teaching in future studies 30 years ago, I was suspicious. I was skeptical. Is this really, are we such in a special time that the rate of change and everybody was talking about it? It's what I call the breathless futurists. Oh, it's a change. Oh, it's changed. It's going so fast. Oh my gosh, watch out, watch out, watch out. You know, all that. We've all been to those talks, right? Calm down, I said. Maybe it's just a matter of perspective, because things that are up close seem to be changing very fast, and things that are far away seem to be changing very slowly. So you're driving along in a car and the telephone poles next to the road are going by very fast, the fence posts. But the mountains in the distance, they don't seem to be moving at all. Actually, they're both moving at the same rate. It's just that our perspective is that. So we are treated today through the media with all of this change and all of this news, and this is changing, and watch out for this, and all of this, and we're swimming in this stuff. And we think about the Renaissance. Not much changed, right? 4 or 5 things in 100 years, my gosh. You know, a few printing presses and a few popes and whatever. And we think all that time and everybody sat around, no change. Well, to those people, it was also changing very fast. Things were changing, their lives were leading, all of those kinds of things. And so I was skeptical that we were really so special. But now I have to take into account the speed of communication, the amount of information because of the digital revolution that we are creating and experiencing. The rate of change is indeed increasing exponentially. What does that have to do with our dealing with the future? Before this enormous change, there was change. The railroad created change. The oil well created change. The electric light created change. But not the kind of change where ideas were colliding with each other and creating innovation, creating issues almost instantaneously. And so the leaders of the past, political and business, could wait for change to occur, could wait for it to be right on their doorstep, and they had time to do something about it. Nothing was so serious. Nothing was so urgent. Now, they felt the pace of change, but we now know their pace of change was quite a bit slower than our pace of change. So waiting for change any longer was not going to work. We are now getting a sense that we have to be better at anticipating changes, getting ready for changes, and knowing what some of those changes may be, even though we can't predict them. We have to do that anyway. Actually, in the United States, the whole discipline of strategic foresight came about because of this rate of change. It was in the 1950s that a very famous futurist, Herman Kahn, was working at the Rand Corporation, the first think tank in the United States, generally working for the Department of Defense. And they were beginning to figure out what a nuclear war was going to be like. This was in the 1950s. They realized that the big difference between nuclear war is that it would be so short and obviously so destructive. Once the missiles appeared on the radar screen, you had no more time to plan. You couldn't sit around and say, oh, let's figure out what we want to do. So literally they created the war game. There had been war games before, but this was very serious. And the scenario. that said, well, what if this happens? And then we will do this, and what if this happens? And they played that game in the Pentagon over and over again to get good at reacting to very, very rapid change. Same problem. Conventional war, you got to move people, got to move machines, got to get ready, got to put everybody in place. The planners have time to think about how we're going to run this war. Nuclear war, no time. So therefore, they created a new way of planning, a new way of envisioning the future, which was the scenario. That's what we're trying to do as well. We can no longer wait for change to occur, and we can no longer wait for it to be certain what the change is going to be, because by that time, it's done. I go from a very serious enterprise like nuclear war to a much more serious enterprise like football, right? This is exactly what teams do. Once the other team has a strategy, the coach can't go back into it and say, okay, now what are we going to do about that? They have to anticipate and get ready and practice and practice and practice against what that other team may do. Are they making predictions? No. They're not saying, well, you can't do that. We didn't predict that. What we're trying to do is to get ready for all manner of change, all manner of issues and problems that the other team throws at us. That's exactly what the scenario is. It is not a prediction. It is practice at dealing with change, any change. Even though those changes don't come about, it is practice nevertheless. We're in better condition. We're more flexible. We're more ready, even eager to see change happen, because then we can move forward. That's what strategic foresight is offering to us. It's very much like physical conditioning. I point out to people that jogging is not transportation, right? You don't get anywhere. You say, well, this is silly. You just ran for an hour, you come back to exactly the same place, you're all hot and you're sweaty and all this kind of stuff. No, but the reason we do it is for conditioning purposes. We didn't get anywhere. So the scenario is not to say what the future will be like. Its purpose is to give us the opportunity of seriously and systematically imagining ourselves in a very different world. So our great-grandparents and previous generations rarely had to imagine that. A few generations were subject to enormous change, revolutions and wars. But throughout most of history, most people were born, they grew up, they lived their life, and they died in the same society. No significant change. That's no longer true. Most of us feel the pressure of having to reinvent ourselves, to reform ourselves, to do things that no school and no parents and no training has required us to do before. We're old and we're still learning, right? Old people used to have to stop learning after a while, and now we're still learning because we're still trying to adapt to change. So wouldn't it be nice to get in shape? So this is like intellectual conditioning, getting in shape to handle change. Just like the football team runs around the field. Well, they're not running around the field to score goals. They're running around the field to give them the strength to be able to play the game. And so we're here for this 2 days to condition ourselves. It's like a camp in that sense, that we're going to talk about change, we're going to consider change, and we're going to try as much as possible imagine what it would be like to live in a world that is significantly different than the one we live in today. And even if we don't get it right, even if we don't predict exactly what's going to happen, we'll be better than the people who are not here. Because they're going to be waiting around for the same thing to happen again. We know it hasn't. They're going to be holding on to the present. We're ready to kind of let it go. They're going to be wondering about what is going on. And we're going to say, okay, here's the change. Let's get on with it, and away we go. There's a very deep principle in all of this, and that is the successful are not able to predict the future. They don't have to predict the future. Generally impossible to do anyway, so why even try? The difficult You know, we try to do the impossible, we leave to somebody else, right? So it's impossible to predict the future. But those who learn about change and those who respond to change more rapidly because they've already conditioned themselves to give up the present to some extent, to be ready to move on. There are a few people in society who really like this kind of change. A lot of times we don't know who they are because they're not allowed to say, because they might be treated as troublemakers or people who are not quite on the team, you know, and they're not quite with the program. But these are people who say, bring it on, because as soon as the change happens, then all the old obstacles to change, all the old habits, all the old traditions, which were wonderful in their time, they're fine, but they're out of date. They don't work anymore. The world has changed, and they're ready to get on with it because those things begin to fall away. Those are the few people who really like it. The rest of us have to learn to like it. The rest of us have to do that. So I put this in a historical context. We're a group today in the universities, in businesses, in government that is inventing a new way to think about the future. And this seminar is a piece of that. It's a way that we can bring that concept, that idea, here to Curitiba, to Brazil in general, and it's my privilege to be able to carry this message to you because that's what we have been doing at the University of Houston all of this time. So now you can think about lunch. And as the presenter said, I'd be very happy to answer questions, comments. I do this all the time, and most people go, oh, I don't have anything. That's okay. But if anybody wants to respond now, I think the count was 1,373 PowerPoint slides. So I'm going to start those very soon here. But before that, be glad to answer any questions that you may have or comments before we get started. See? All right, I've stunned you into silence. All right. Well, that's fine. So we'll get started. We are going to do an introductory session to who we all are, a little exercise right after we take our coffee break this morning, so you will have a chance to meet and to find out who all is here. But let me proceed with the presentation, particularly for the sake of those, for the audience out there, and I believe that they're allowed to ask questions as well, so we may have some questions coming in from them. First of all, I have two topics to cover. As Rui said, the slides are in the book there if you like to follow along. If you like to just sit back and listen, it's up to you. You want to take notes, obviously. And I do encourage as much interaction as possible. So if you have a question, raise your hand, say it in Portuguese, and Lisa will translate it for me. I'll repeat the question for the videos, and we can go on. So we want to make it as interactive as possible. I mean, I'm a college professor. I can talk for 2 straight days, right? So I'm good at that. So if you want to stop me, you got to raise your hand and say this, say this, say this. And then don't worry, I may cover it later on, but I like to answer the question when it comes up rather than always having to wait. So the topic is strategic foresight. We first of all have to talk about names. I started teaching in future studies in the 1980s at the University of Houston Clear Lake, which is a branch campus of the University of Houston. It's where the program was established. I wish I could say that I established the program. Didn't. I wish I could say that I came to the University of Houston Clear Lake to teach in the program. I didn't. My becoming a futurist is absolutely total dumb luck. And I'm very happy for that. Remember, the old phrase is, better be lucky than good. Well, I'm very lucky. Because I came to Clear Lake in the middle 70s, when that was a brand new campus that had created a concept of a new type of university. And it was a very exciting time. We all had come from traditional universities. My degree was from Michigan State University, had been around for 150 years, all of that traditional academic higher education stuff. We're going to do something new. This was the 20th century after all, right? We're going to do something new. We had just come out of the 60s and the 70s. Those were interesting times. Lots of change going on there. So the administration assembled a group of faculty members, and I was lucky to be hired by them to create a new university. And we had a new university for about 6 years. Then a new administration came in. They didn't want to create a new university. The faculty who we hired since the beginning didn't want to create a new university. The students who came to the university didn't want to create a new university. The taxpayers didn't want a new university. The businesses didn't want a new university. So there we were all by ourselves thinking we were creating a new university. So by 1980 or 1981, the whole concept of this special new university had pretty well gone away. University of Houston Clear Lake is now a very good, basically regional university that serves working people. We don't have fraternities, we don't have residence halls, we don't have football teams. People come there to learn, to get a degree, to go on and be successful in the career. So in that sense, it's a good place, but it's not a new university. One thing that happened, however, was that the dean of the school hired 2 faculty members to establish the Future Studies program. And they did that, and that survived for 25 years until we were kicked out because we didn't make enough money. I mean, it's just like football, you know. It's in the end, it's a business, right? All the loyalty and all the fans, but if you're Beckham, you go where the money goes, right? You know, all the loyalty doesn't count. But now that's a whole different story. So I came to teach statistics, which I did for 6 or 7 years. I heard about this futures thing, and my own interest was in social change, but I never thought I could really teach the future. Who can teach the future? It's the stupidest, what do you mean? Can't do this. I remember meeting the dean. The deans would travel around the country in those days, and I met him at the Atlanta airport for lunch. We had a little interview, and at the very end of it, I said, in the catalog, I saw this thing called Future Studies. What is that? I think I was a little edgy because I was a sociologist, you know, I was scientific. You can't study the future, you can't do any of this stuff. And he said, we study the past, don't we? I said, yes. Why can't we study the future? Well, I had a lot of reasons why not to study the future, but I wanted the job. So I was good enough to keep my mouth shut. And I got the job. And lo and behold, 6 or 7 years later, here I am, a futurist, more surprised than anybody else that my career had turned out this way. So beginning there in the 1980s. Now, the 1980s was a very difficult time for this field. 1965 to 1975, I will call the golden age of future studies. Change is everywhere. That's why I changed from physics to sociology, because there's so much going on. In the U.S., we had the anti-war movement, we had civil rights, the environmental movement begins, and the first Earth Day is 1970. There's all this change going on. The World Future Society is created. The World Future Studies Federation is created around that same time. The program in Clear Lake, the program in Hawaii were both created in the middle 70s. So those were very heady times. And those were driven by the baby boom. And the baby boom during those days were adolescents. They were college students. I don't know if any of you know adolescents. They're a little impatient, right? I mean, we want change and we want it now. We're not going to wait for you old people to do anything. We're going to do this right now. Well, come 1975 and 1980 and 1985, the baby boom stopped becoming this engine of change and turned into what in those days we called the me generation. It's not about changing the world, it's about me. Because now they realized they had to get a job, they had to raise a family, they had to pay the mortgage, they had to cut their hair, they had to put a suit on, and all those kind of things. So they became the most individualistic, self-centered, egocentric generation in the world. So who's interested in the future? Not us. So the whole interest in the field just dove down. We had single-digit people in the program. We survived. We got through that. But during that time, we told people, do not put the word future on your resume. Now, the degree is called Studies of the Future, so it's really hard to do. You can put anything on your resume you want. Very few people ask you for a transcript, so you can put whatever you want. But don't call yourself a futurist, because that, in those days, you were some kind of fuzzy-headed, wild-eyed, hair on fire kind of a person who was out of touch with reality and crystal balls and all of that kind of stuff. So it comes around the 1990s. So we have a war. Whoa, the first Gulf War. We have the collapse of the Soviet Union. We have the internet. We have the tech bubble. All of a sudden everybody, where's a futurist? You know, I need a futurist to help me figure out what's going on here. And since then, of course, we've had 9/11 and the financial collapse, and these disruptions keep coming one after the other. So we're in much better shape than we were before. As a result, the word futurist has become pretty much the common term for the people like me and the people we graduate. People who deal in the long-term future, anticipating and influencing change and helping others to do so. The problem with the field, however, the field itself has had many, many names been proposed. One of the earliest names was futurology. Well, that sounds, it never took on. You'd think it would be the right name because it's like anthropology or sociology or geology. It's the study of the future, futurology. What could be more obvious than that? Well, that didn't make it. Some people wanted to call it futurism. It's kind of a study of that, but there were other isms that we didn't want to kind of be related to, like fascism and racism and feminism and things like that. So nobody liked the ism part. And future studies and futures research kind of became the academic title. And that's a very good title because there are other studies in the university. There are urban studies and women's studies and African American studies and all of these studies. So future studies was okay within the university. But then we started graduating people who were going out into business and government and acting like professional futurists, and they didn't think of themselves as studies people. They were action people. They were doing things. They were doing consulting. They were doing planning and forecasting and all these things. So we had to find a different name for it. And the problem is that in English, there is no name for what we do. We had to make up a name. There is a name in Portuguese. What's the name in Portuguese? Your name, the name of your firm? No? Curitiba. It comes from the French, the Romance languages, prospective, and these were French social scientists in the 1950s who said prospective and prospectiva has two meanings, has two connotations. One is to see ahead, and the other is to act ahead. So you have a word in Portuguese that we don't have in English. We don't have any word that captures both of those. So what we did was take the word foresight, which was seeing ahead, and we are redefining it, calling it strategic foresight to mean it's not just seeing ahead, but also acting ahead. We have a word in English that is called proactive. We have a lot of word for forecasting. We have foresight, forecasting, all of that. But nothing for acting ahead. We have the word called proactive, but there is no word, believe it or not, proaction. It's an adjective. It's not a noun. And one word doesn't cover all of those. So strategic foresight is now the name. We've actually changed the name of our degree program from future studies to foresight. We wanted it to be, I don't know if any of you are from universities, believe it or not, there's politics within the university just like every place else. And we wanted it to be strategic foresight, but our department said, oh no, you can't use the word strategic. Why not? That's what we're doing. Well, the business school believes they own the word strategic. Talk about freedom, academic freedom of press, and freedom of speech. We can't use that word because they own that word. Okay, so we're just foresight. But I use strategic foresight all the time. So to give you a sense of what this is, and I've already kind of pointed out what the two major divisions of foresight is. Forecasting, and we use the word forecasting, and we'll definitely talk about that. And that's basically describing the future. It's a descriptive thing. Scenarios, stories of how things could happen. But we don't stop there because we also have planning. We also want to influence the future. We want to take actions. So we'll see the basis of this in our analysis of change, but the most important thing is that it's both of these things simultaneously. There are those who say that one ought not to do forecasting unless you also do planning. And that's a valid position. Why do something unless you're going to take action? Certainly in a business, in a government agency, your job is to influence the future, not just to study it. Well, I'm a college professor. I like to study things for their own sake. I mean, we study history, right? When's the last time you used history in business? Very little, right? But nevertheless, it's still good to know. So I think forecasting by itself would be nice. What actually happens is that planning by itself is much more common. Don't everybody say, well, we need a strategic plan. Okay, what do we want to do? Oh, this is what we want to do. These are our goals, our vision. How are we going to do it? Oh, here's our strategy. So let's get organized. Let's do all this kind of stuff. Is anybody taking into account what's going on in the world? By the way, if you do it that way, you are assuming the world will be the same throughout the whole time of the plan. That's a pretty dangerous assumption. If you're going to plan lunch, you're probably in pretty good shape. But if you're going to plan a new acquisition of a company 5 years down the road, you have to take into account also. So we always talk about these two divisions of the field. They're analytical distinctions. The future is made up of what the world does and what we do. Always, always, always together. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. Now, I also have to admit that I have a tendency for images about the sea, about the ocean. When I came to Houston, I did a very stupid thing. I bought a sailboat in Florida. I don't know how your geography is, but there's a long way between. So I had a guy drag the boat, a great boat, and I sailed it across the Gulf of Mexico for about 6 or 7 years. Sailed to Mexico, Louisiana, Florida, places like that. It was a very solid boat, a very heavy boat, a very slow boat. So as a result, I had lots of time to sit there in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico and think about things. So I tend to think of these kind of analogies. And when I think about the boats of old, there are 4 major roles that I want to point out. There's others. You need a cook, but that's not part of the future. The captain, of course, sets the destination. We're going to this port. We're going to that land. The first mate organizes everybody. They're the COO of the boat. They say, okay, your job is this, and here's the schedule, and you're on watch during these times. That's the manager of the boat. But there are 2 futurists on the boat, and one is the lookout. So they usually take some little kid who can't do much of anything else, probably somebody's cousin, or nephew or something. Say, go up on the top of the mast and tell us if you see anything. I don't know if anybody's been on the top of a mast at sea. It's not a comfortable place to be, I can guarantee. I mean, on the deck, it's kind of gently rolling along. On up there, you're hanging on back and forth, back and forth. So he's up there, and he's looking out over the horizon. Why is he better than all of the people on the deck? Is purely geometry. He sees over their horizon to his horizon. His horizon is 40 miles away, and theirs is 20 miles away. So the analogy is that futurists are looking over the horizon, not because we're any smarter, but because we try and stay away from the current buzzing stuff. So we defocus on that, focusing on those very long-term things. And that's the lookout function. So we say, here's change, just like the lookout. So the lookout sees a dark shape on the horizon. Oh, there's something out there, over there on the port side at 10 o'clock. And the crew says, what is it? Lookout says, I don't know. It's just kind of a dark shape. There's something happening out there. Oh, really? Well, what's going to happen? Hey, I told you I didn't even know what it was, much less what's going to happen. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you what's going to happen. Oh, then they say, well, what should we do about it? Again, let me get it clear. I am pointing out change to you and shouting down to the deck saying, here's this change, here's that change, here's this change. You got to figure this out. You have to decide what you're going to do, how you're going to react, and all of that. I'm just a lookout. And that's what a futurist does. We're the lookout. We're pointing out aspects of change. At the same time, there's another futurist there who does have a responsibility for taking steps, and that's the navigator. So they get the dividers and the circles, and they're the ones who plot the course, given all of this information of where the ship is supposed to go. So they tell the helmsman, okay, steer this heading, go this far, turn this way, that. That's the planner. So futurists are that not for next year or the year after. The big difference is that we don't, like I said, we don't get out of bed for anything less than 5 years. And we're talking many times about the rest of the century. Somebody asked me once, well, how long is it useful to think about the future? So is it 10 years or 20 years or 50 years? And so my response was, how long is it good to think about the past? More than 50 years, right? I mean, we've studied the past for thousands of years. Now, can we usefully study the future for thousands of years? Well, believe it or not, there are people who do it. They're called science fiction writers. They're the ones who are treating us with ideas of very, very different societies. I wouldn't necessarily use those in business, but some people do. So yes, we're long term. 5, 10, 20 years is usually what we're talking about. Up to I'm teaching a high school class right now. In the first time that I've done that, I've taught math in high school way back when. It's actually, my wife is the principal of the school. She also graduated with a futures degree. So she said, okay, come teach a class. Let me tell you, work for your wife, it's a new experience, right? I mean, not only do I have to keep her happy at home, now I have to keep her happy at work. So, but we're talking about Houston in 2040. That's what the purpose of this class is. So we tend to be very long term. Is it possible to be certain about those times? Absolutely not. And that's the core of our discipline, is how we can handle that. All right, so that's the field, the two big pieces of the field. There is, this is actually, these are in the handouts, I think, but they're not in the slides. Well, they're in the slide. No, they're in the slides here. Well, they're bigger in the handouts, but you can kind of see. You can kind of see the. This is basically the field in three pieces. How we think about change, and that'll be our second topic here this morning. The methods of the field. The methods of the field are basic thinking skills, how to think about the future, creative thinking, critical thinking. We have a whole course in systems thinking, and visioning and decision making, and all of the methods. And notice that these little arrows, these things blow up into enormous numbers of methods, most of which we won't touch on in this seminar, of course. This is what we cover in our graduate degree. But the methods of the field, and then futurism as a field. Futurists, different kinds, organizations, all the different groups of organizations, and the orientation of futurists. There are two basic orientations. The kind of futurists like I am and that we graduate in our program are called applied futurists. We're the people who are at service of others. So we work for businesses, we work for government agencies. We don't particularly bring an agenda. Our agenda is you should think about the long-term future, you should do it well, you should take action, be proactive, be empowered, et cetera, et cetera. But what your goals are, those are up to you. Now, other people believe that that means we would work for the mafia or for Colombian drug lords. No, we don't do that. So we generally, we believe that most businesses are ethical and honest, and most governments are the same. The normative futurists are also futurists, but they bring an agenda. So the people who are worried about, and very worried about climate change and those things, or those who are touting how wonderful the technology is going to be and the singularity and all of these kind of tremendous, those are all normative futurists projecting a particular version of the future. And they're futurists too. I wouldn't say they're not. Most of the futurists in the world are applied. A few of the others are advocating for a particular one. So that's the field at the very highest level. We deal with change through methods in various shapes and sizes of organizations and different kinds of people. So I can answer any questions about any of those details as we get on. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Yes. All right, sir. This is a book that Andy Hines, my colleague, Andy is the real writer. I'm the talker. He's a very good presenter too. We do our seminars. Rui knows him very well together, but he is much more of a writer than I am. And we did this book in 2007 that was a collection of tips and techniques from our colleagues in the Association of Professional Futurists. We asked them a question, said, if you were to tell new people who are just starting out, what should they remember? What should they know? We collected about 150 of those and put them into a kind of a handbook. It's a book that you put on the side table at night to go to sleep with. You don't sit down and read it straight through. But it does have lots of different advice. And we divided the world of futures into three big sections. Framing. So this is the beginning of a project. And every project has a beginning, a scope, time, conditions. If you're going to start a new product, you're going to build a bridge, you're going to acquire a company, you're going to institute a new policy in government. There's a beginning to those things. The difference in strategic foresight is that nobody knows what you're doing. So you have to spend a lot of time on framing. This is what we're doing. This is what the effect is. We're not predicting the future. We're not guaranteeing things. We're giving you a sense of what may happen and all of that. So purpose and scope is extremely important. This is the forecasting side. It's divided into research. We gather information both from other people and from the internet and academic research, and then we put all that together into the various kinds of scenarios that we do. So that's the forecasting side. The planning side has three pieces: setting goals or visions, planning, standard kind of strategic planning, and acting. using the plan, executing the plan. I want to tell you that except for maybe more emphasis on vision and more emphasis on long-term strategic goals that we emphasize, our version of planning is pretty much like everybody else's version of planning. Strategic planning is that: goals, strategies, actions, those kinds of things. I wish we had a lot more revolutionary or new ideas here. This is where the revolution occurs, because the way people think about the future, and I'll point out later on, how we learn to think about the future is generally mistaken. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's not very helpful. So this is where the real contribution and the new ideas are in forecasting using scenarios. So that's kind of an overview of the field, where it all goes. Another way of looking at this is that we divide into understanding the future and influencing the future. These same kind of techniques all throughout, but this is what I'll call the academic's view. Research, act, look, move, that kind of thing. Most action people in business and government are not academics, thankfully, okay? All right, you shouldn't be, I can tell you. So they want to do something. They want to start with a vision. They want to start with a goal. This is what we need to accomplish. But as I pointed out before, they ought to take some time to take a look at what's happening out in the world, because you could make a serious mistake. You could misjudge the fact that the world will stay the same while you go for a goal and all of a sudden you realize somebody moved the table and you fall on your face. So knowing what's happening out there is important, even though your primary purpose is to accomplish some kind of a goal and some kind of a vision. So we're always doing both. We're always doing forecasting and planning simultaneously. And this is the real eye chart. This is the one that is the methods of the future. I've expanded that. Basically, they're the same thinking tools up here: systems thinking, critical thinking. We'll talk a little bit about that. The data collection pieces, notice that there's research and scanning. Research is standard kind of social science. Scanning is really looking for change, is looking for the signs of change. We have a saying in English that we wait for the robins. When the robins come, then the spring is not far behind. So when the buds on the trees, they're the precursors. We're looking for those little teeny signs of change so that they may become important. These are all of the forecasting techniques, lots and lots of them. I'm not going to go through that. So don't worry, don't panic. But we wrote a paper on that, and all of these different techniques are there. And then planning down here: visioning, planning, and change management. You see the three pieces from the previous. Notice that there are almost no techniques there. There's only one specific technique, maybe two, that we know about visioning. And strategic planning is strategic planning, and creating change is creating change. So I wish we had this much in the forecasting side, on the action side, but things are what they are. Those are pretty much, that takes a lot more experience. One doesn't have as many sophisticated techniques as one could have. So this is our approach then. We're obviously in the very first time to get ready, get started. We're actually going to have a chance this morning to do a little bit about change, and then we will get into the forecasting for the rest of today. So fundamentally, today is about change and forecasting. Then we specifically do the scenario development and implications of scenarios tomorrow morning, and then move into a little bit of the action side. As I say, you know a lot of that. We have a difference in emphasis, and I'll share that. And then finally, one of our graduates and the instructor of our introductory course has created a very sophisticated model for evaluating the quality of foresight practices within businesses and government agencies. So we'll end up with that. And that's a tool that you can use not only to assess your own foresight, but also to set some goals. Maybe we want to be better at this and better at that. It's very specific on basically how to do that. So that's our agenda. I like to think that we've had a very famous mayor of the city of Chicago, Richard Daley. His son was just the mayor. He retired from that. But in the old days of Chicago politics, they had a saying during election day, which was that everyone should vote early and vote often. So I believe the same thing about breaks. So we were here. You've been very, very polite, and sitting here listening to me talk for all of 2 days is not going. So we need to sometimes get up and move around. And so I'm maybe gonna break this schedule a little bit so we don't have to have all that. You don't mind that, having breaks, right? Breaks is the best part of the day, right? Oh, now we have to go back and listen to that professor talk further. Okay. No, so a chance to network and but before that, I'm going to require, to get the break, we're going to have 3 comments or 3 questions. So take one for the team here. Raise your hand. We're going to get you talking a little bit to say what it is that you would like to learn about this time, what your objectives are, a comment or a question that you have about Foresight in general before we get to the study of change. And we're not going to have a break until 3 people do that. Yes, sir, please. All right. Please, yes. Yes. Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Until the action.
Mm-hmm.
After the action was done,
Mm-hmm.
You have a study to know what was effective, what went right, and what went wrong. And under these questions, I would like to ask you, could you tell me something that in all these years you have foresighted
Mm-hmm.
in your study,
Mm-hmm.
and in that effects,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that you study the effects
Right.
that happen
Mm-hmm.
after you study, and say, okay, I have foresighted that oil, for instance, that in the 70s, I remember, the oil, the world is going to run out of oil, and everything is going to stop. You have to go to other technologies and so forth. Now we found out that we have much more oil
Mm-hmm.
that we could ever think of. And as a matter of fact, this week, Petrobras started with the new oil salt level and so forth. And people say,
Yep.
well, we have so much oil in the U.S. and in Europe and all over in Africa. And this is too expensive.
Right. So there are really two questions, and they both have the same kind of a theme. One question is, after the action, do you do what the military calls after-action reports? So we've just had an action. Do we sit back? Of course. And this is a continuous process, a continuous learning process of what we can do and how we can do it better. The problem with the actions, and the reason that I say there's so few techniques. There are very few reproducible techniques in taking action, but there are dozens and dozens of theories. Call them opinions. I had occasion once, in fact this was for a European oil company, they asked me to give them a seminar on how to create change. They wanted to become a learning organization, Peter Senge's concept in the 1990s. And I went to the library at Rice University, which is a wonderful little private university in Houston, very, very prestigious, and they had an excellent business library. And I went to the section of the library that was about organizational change. It was 2 floor-to-ceiling bookshelves full of books, the same library number, all of them. So I spent the afternoon there, pulled them off the shelf, kind of looked at the table of contents, took a few notes. In the end of the day, I came up with 16 different theories of how to create change in organizations. So it's not that we don't know enough, we know too much. We know you should do it this way, you should do it that way. And since then, this was in the 1990s, since then I'm sure there's another dozen more. So it's very hard to pin down. It's not like chemistry, it's not like engineering, it's not like math. When we're dealing with individuals, this in the social sciences, which this is, and creating change is that, it's very ambiguous what works and what doesn't. It has a lot to do with the situation. It has a lot to do with the needs of the people. It has a lot to do with the competencies of the people who are directing the change and things like that. So it's much more, I won't call it an art exactly, but it's much more a craft. So throwing pots is not science, but there is skill involved. But different potters will throw different kinds of pots, and they'll have different styles. Writers will all write about the same thing, but it's a craft. So creating change is a craft. It's not a science. And so reflecting on how well we did is absolutely important. But in terms of a very strict evaluation, like the load, on the bridge after you build it, probably not possible. Now the other question was, how accurate have I been? What did I think that? And I have to tell you, we have an expression in English called drinking the Kool-Aid, which is you become a normative futurist, and we were all normative futurists in the 1970s. We thought the world was coming to an end. My father, he had 2 careers. His first career was in marketing with Shell Oil Company. And he said, they thought that happened in 1930s. We would run out of oil. And it's not going to happen again. And I thought, yes, it is. It's absolutely going to happen. And then 1981 came. It didn't. And now we have, like you say, lots of oil. Whether that oil is as what shall I say, as inexpensive as it used to be, it's not. As easy to get as it used to be, it's not. And the accumulation of burning fossil fuels may come back in terms of feedback so that we, frankly, will leave a lot of oil in the ground, either because it's too expensive and substitutions become better, or that the effects are too much more than we really want to handle. So we're not out of the oil picture yet at all, but yes, all of us were surprised with the fact that the 1980s were not as dire and as catastrophic as we thought. So that was a big surprise. That did not surprise the scenario planners at the Shell Oil Company, however. They knew they had a scenario. They didn't know they had a scenario in 1979 when the price was going up, that the price could collapse. And that's recorded very well in Peter Schwartz's book called The Art of the Long View. If you want to read one book about Foresight, in addition to my own, but the one that really tells this business story, it's called The Art of the Long View. He was the director of their scenario process in the 1980s and tells some great stories and has lots of techniques in there for that. So they were not surprised. They were not surprised by the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, that surprised the CIA, right? Well, they've been surprised a lot. They're not. But so those kind of surprises. I would say that futurists in general, however, are less surprised than most people. Because again, we're focusing on this long term. So when the internet becomes the most important thing in our lives, well, not the most important, but becomes a very important thing in our lives, that's not surprising at all. One of the 2 faculty members who founded the Futurist program, I remember listening, and he's a brilliant guy. He's now a big professor at Harvard University. He gave a speech in late 1980s, before HTML, before the World Wide Web, and I don't think he used the word, but he was talking about hyperlinks. He was talking about 3-dimensional information spaces that you could navigate rather than, so we had word processors in those days, we had computers in those days, but he was talking about now what we take for granted, which is this navigational space and what the advantages would be, the disadvantages would be. So he was not surprised by all this. He was actually talking about it as it came along. So we're ready. And one of the slides I'll show later on is that the attitude is we try to be surprised. We want to be surprised. Now, being surprised is sometimes pleasant. We go to the movies and this plot twists, or we go to to the amusement park and the fun house and all of the and we go to horror movies and Halloween and all that kind of thing. We do that on purpose. Being surprised at work, not such a good thing, right? You always say, "Oh yeah, we knew that was going to happen." You rush back to the office. Did you know what just happened? So whether you've communicated to your colleagues or not, the attitude is looking to be surprised in a little way every day, rather than being surprised in a big way once in your career. So we call that a CLE. Everybody likes acronyms. That's a career limiting event. Being surprised a big way. So it's very much like a vaccine. You take a little bit of a disease and your body becomes immune to it. Defenses have that. So we take surprise a little bit at a time, all the time. So that when a big surprise comes along, we go, yeah, well, no, it didn't happen exactly like we thought, but it has happened too. So there have been surprises. No one is immune from surprise. It's how you take it. You either take it over time, a little bit at a time, and for those whom you trust, you admit that. I didn't know that. Tell me about that. Oh, really? I thought it was the other way. And you don't do that to the boss, or whatever. But for those who are, you're allowed to say, I was surprised. And now I know more, because what happens after surprise is that we're better educated. We're more aware. We know what's going to them. So being surprised is okay, though we have this facade at work that, oh, I know everything and I'm never surprised and everything is fine. So I've been surprised, yeah. Obviously, big attacks like, 9/11 and very few people in the futures world was surprised by the financial collapse, for instance. I mean, that bubble was, about to burst for any amount of time, so we're talking about that. And the interesting thing about being surprised in the past is that we now understand how it happened. And we always say we should have known, because the signs were there. But when we look in the future, what are the surprises that will surprise us in the future? And our tendency is to say, oh, that's not going to happen. Or, that's too bizarre. That's just, that's not going to happen. And I admit, it's probably not going to happen. But our practice of the conditioning is to imagine that it did. And put ourselves in the place of being after we're surprised. And then go back and say, what will we do now? And what are the signs and all of that? Now, the problem is, now we know what the big surprises were in the past, and we know what all the precursors were. The precursors in 9/11 were people in the United States who were signing up to learn how to fly airplanes, but they didn't want to learn how to take them off or land them. How stupid is that? And I mean, the FBI had reports of those people. The flight schools were telling the FBI, we have these strange people who are not concerned about taking off and landing. Do you know what's going on? Well, so what the FBI says, well, it's not a crime. I mean, you may kill yourself, but that's not a crime. Well, they were planning on killing themselves and a whole bunch of other people besides. So we should have known. Well, now, 2013, what are the signs? What should we have known that will be a surprise in 14 or 15 or 2020 that we should have taken steps to take attention to now? That's a much more difficult task, because they're all over, they're all around. We've got all of these issues and all of these changes and all of these things that could happen, and which of those are we supposed to pay attention to? Which of the 1,000 things that could happen are we supposed to have paid attention to in 2001? It's very, very difficult to do. So being surprised is a natural condition. It's a natural risk. Looking to be surprised as much as possible is the antidote to that. It doesn't eliminate it. Even some people that get a vaccine get the disease anyway, but very, very much fewer. So being surprised a little bit all the time is the attitude we want to try and foster, so that when the big change comes, we're, oh yeah, we thought about that, and whatever. And we're not as surprised as the next person. That's the conditioning I was talking about, the kind of habit of mind. Appreciate the question. Excellent, excellent question. Got 2 more before break. Somebody else has. Yes, sir, please. Yes. Yes, right. Yep. Well, the question is, from a risk analysis point of view, getting people to think out of the box. Okay, because
How is the reaction of our society nowadays
right.
to think in a different way?
Okay, how to think about it a different way. Let me talk about the box. So the box is important and it's valuable. So let's not do away with the box. The box is culture, it's tradition, it's habit. The analogy I use in engineering is friction. Engineers hate friction, right? Wear and tear, using up energy, creates heat. They would love a world without friction, and then you point out to them, well, then of course you can't walk on the floor. You can't pick up this glass. Your clothes fall off of you. Your pants fall down. Well, okay, so friction does have a value. And so it's a natural part of life which we have to overcome. So the box is a natural part of life. The box is like in my heavy boat, the huge lead weight in the bottom. So when the wind blows, the boat will only heel over like this. It won't go flat on the sea. If you just have a rowboat and a sail on it, a little bit of a wind and the thing is flat. So it's totally useless. So you have to have the ballast. So the ballast was weight. That boat would have gone a lot faster without a big heavy keel, but it also would have been flat sideways on the water. So it's a combination of recognizing the box and then trying to get out of the box when it's important. And it's not always important. Culture, tradition. If we didn't have the box, we would wake up every day in a brand new world. And the company would have a different mission and all of those things. So it's a balance. So I don't criticize the box. But boxes have a way of becoming, as I said before, outdated and obsolete. I don't criticize the past. I value the past. I celebrate the past. The past has allowed us to be here today, to enjoy the life, the privileges, and the standard of living, and the kind of, we're living in a world, frankly, and those of us who are privileged in that world are, amazing. Imagine if you're the king of England in the Renaissance. You're like going to the outhouse to go to the bathroom. We have so many more things that even the most wealthy people in the past had is an ordinary life for us. So that's part of the box. But those things become outdated. And when the world changes, we need to change. That was my point about why strategic foresight in the second half of the 20th century, because the world has changed. And that change requires us to take a different attitude towards the future, to spend time on the future in a systematic manner. Not only was history invented, all of the functions in the companies and the agencies that you work in were invented at one point. Accounting. The Greeks didn't do double entry bookkeeping. 100 years ago, an owner of a business kept a book, and they wrote down what money they made, and on the other page they wrote down the expenses, and at the end of the month they said, well, this is what it is. There was no process to it. They were just using common sense. And now we have accountants. I don't know how much common sense there is in there, but at least we have that. And we have marketing people, we have HR people, and we have engineers. We have all of these professions which at one point were what the owner and the inventor and the people in the business just did as part of their trade. Now these are separate categories of professional experience. So getting out of the box means that we believe we should create a separate function, that there's generally a planning function in most large organizations, but there's not a lookout function. People are supposed to kind of do that on their own. They're supposed to read and talk. But does everybody do their accounting? Does everybody do their marketing? Does everybody do their HR on their own? No, we have professionals for that. So our point is that somebody should be looking out on the far distant horizon and bringing that information back into the organization for people to consider. That's what the strategic foresight function is. So it's a tension. The box is valuable, but it becomes outdated. And the attitude of mind is recognizing before the next guy that the world has changed. And that requires us to change, which is very, very hard to do, but necessary anyway. Yes, sir, please. Last question. Yes, right. Right.
like a moving target. So how to deal with this uncertainty about the future when you're looking to the future, trying to have this kind of strategic foresight? How do you cope with this? Because it's not like, oh well, the future will I know what is going to happen
Mhm.
so you decide to follow this path and it will be right. Okay. It's not like this. It's a moving target. So you adapt on the path to try to
The-
deal with this.
Okay, that's the rest of the seminar, number one, or the forecasting piece. So you put your finger on one of the revolutionary concepts that strategic foresight is offering our time, and that is how to handle uncertainty. Traditional forecasters, everyone admits you can't predict the future, and then they go ahead and do it anyway. Wait a minute, the reason is because they don't know how to handle what you pointed to was the uncertainties. And the past is full of data, and we should look to the past. We will look to the past here in this seminar. I'm not absenting the past, but how we use the past and what it can tell us about the future and what is left over as uncertain about the future needs to be explicitly identified. Because what you get from I had a talk on the future of the hospitality and travel industry some months ago. Looked up all the reports of various consultancies and government agencies, got about a dozen of them, some of them done by my colleagues in the Association of Professional Futurists. 11 of the 12 only gave one future. They will admit we can't predict the future, and then they went ahead and did it. So what we have brought to this process of thinking about the future is how you identify uncertainty and how you manage uncertainty. Now, And the answer is not, it is a moving target. It is moving targets. There are many, many futures. Now, how do you make a plan against many, many futures? Well, how does the coach plan the game plan against many, many futures? This is where the big bucks are. This is where skill is involved. If you knew the future, then a computer could do the plan. A person with a very limited education. Well, obviously we should do this. It is planning against an uncertain future where you know the uncertainties, where you know most of the uncertainties, and where you have identified them and their consequences. That's where the skill of planning and action come in the face of an uncertain future. So I admit your problem exactly. We do not know the future. What we have not done to date is brought that knowledge of the uncertainties of the future and put it on the table and left it on the table. Because what traditional forecasting does is basically say, well, we'll assume this trend will continue for another 5 years. End of story. There is no uncertainty left in the forecast. The world doesn't know we've made that assumption. The world doesn't know we've taken out all the possibilities that trend will change. The world will go ahead and continue to do what it's going to be doing. It's we who have limited our knowledge to this particular narrow future. So you've set up the problem of dealing with the long-term future exactly. And the response is, there is uncertainty. We need to know how to identify it and to manage it. So, exactly. Thank you very much for those who will get everybody else later on. Hey, can we take a, yes, sir, please.
We have one question.
Oh, we do? Oh, excellent.
Yeah,
Good.
This is from one of the courses that are attending.
Oh, wonderful.
Transmission.
Hello.
Her name is Adriana Medeiros,
Okay.
and she's asking you, what's the importance and what would be the type of information system you would understand as the most adequate to help organizations in the foresight process?
So the question is, what type of information systems will be helpful in forecasting? A very, very good question. Thank you very much for that question. It depends on what you mean by information systems. One of the I would say unsettled questions in this field, and technical people will always want to know this, is in the field of what's called knowledge management. The amount of information today is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, it's an ocean of information. So we don't lack for information. We lack for the means to be able to manage and handle all that information. And when we get professional futurists together and we ask them, how do you manage your information? Everybody does it differently. So there is really no one way of doing it. So it's not a computer database or Access or ERP or anything. Some companies do it fairly well. They share that information. Others don't do it very well. So obviously, the more information that people have access to, the better. The big problem is not information processing as an IT function. The big problem is getting people to share their information. Because the old concept, and this is not so true of young people today who are putting their lives out on Facebook. Maybe that's a mistake, maybe not. But nevertheless, they're doing it. For those of us who came out of a different age and a different era, we like to keep our information, to ourselves. We don't like to be quite as open and transparent as to other people. We don't like to share that information. So the problem is, if I'm going to, and we have this in the university, and I know there's no politics in business, right? But, if I have information for my function, do I share it with manufacturing? Or do I share it with marketing? Or do I share it with accounting? No, they better not, we better not share. So the bigger problem is human behavior, not information. We have all the tools that we need if we were not quite so interested in using our information for ourselves as opposed to somebody else. So the human problem is way bigger than I believe that one of the forecasts, one of the promises of big data, the analytics functions, is that we will develop systems that will be pretty good at picking out patterns of huge amounts of data. That's what they tell us they're working on. We'll see if it happens. It's another one of those promises. Some promises turn out to be true, some do not. So it could be in 5 or 10 years that we will all have available to us, very much like the translation systems today. I mean, if you do a search on Google and Google comes up and says, this is Portuguese, do you want to translate it in English? It's not the best translation, it's not literary, but you know what it says, okay? And the fact that they did that without any knowledge of language is the biggest surprise of all. The fact that they were able to do that, all they did was take 10,000 texts in English that were also in Portuguese, and they compared the two patterns. I mean, it's almost like magic. They didn't know anything about nouns and verbs or syntax or meaning. It's just that when this pattern occurs in Portuguese, this pattern occurs in English, bingo bango, you get translations. So that's the kind of magic that the analytics functions are supposed to perform for us. Now, translation is one thing. Understanding and picking out important information is something entirely different. So whether they're able to live up to that promise, I don't know. But that's something to look forward to. And I know in the world of education, people are studying it very closely to be able to study the patterns. There's a great YouTube video from the president of a company in the U.S. called edX, which is putting courses online, MOOCs. And his point is that we have millions and millions and millions of clicks from students. And we know who got a good grade and we know who didn't. And we know the pattern of clicks of those who got a good grade and the pattern of clicks of those who didn't. And we know what they did. So we compare just the clicks. We're not analyzing their knowledge. We're not analyzing the math problem or the history problem. We're just analyzing the pattern of clicks so that we get people to do the clicks that get them the good grade. Sounds a little rudimentary, but with millions, billions literally, of data points, they believe that just like Google has billions of data points in the translations of these texts, they have billions of data points in these clicks, and they can discern patterns of successful people and not so successful people, so they can route the non-successful into different patterns. It sounds like magic. Arthur C. Clarke, famous phrase, advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. That's what he said. He said, because you always go, how did they do that? I remember the first time I did a sum in a spreadsheet. Wow, how did they do that? I mean, I did my whole dissertation, on calculator. All of a sudden this thing all just kind of summed itself. I said, how did they do that? So that's the kind, and now we've taken that for granted. I mean, electric lights. How do they do that, right? But we take all this for granted, but big data and analytics is an area where it will, if it lives up to the promise, it will appear magical to us. Great. Thank you for the question. Well, wonderful, yeah. So we've earned a break, right? We have 15 minutes, Rui, for, yes, please.
You mentioned, Peter,
Yes.
a book called The Ark of the Long View.
Yes.
That's the second best book.
Well, it's a different kind of a book, right? Yes.
Just to let you know that we have a lot of books here at that table. So feel free to take a look during the breaks, some magazines too.
Yes.
What else? Oh yes, Laura, your question was good because there are some books that show predictions that didn't happen. Very interesting. How they imagine transportation, how they imagine education. And so some of these books are here, so you can go there.
Rui's comment is that there have been people that have studied the accuracy of forecasts and what works and what doesn't. My colleague Andy Hines published a book in 1995, Forecasting Science and Technology for 2025. Just a few years ago, he looked back at that and said, here's what we got right, here's what we got wrong, and these are some of the patterns that we find. So there are people reflecting on that. Accuracy is not our most important criterion, but still, it's a good idea to reflect on the quality of the practice. Okay, now can we have a break? Oh, Aline. Okay, good.
Obrigada a todos pela atenção. A gente encerra então a transmissão ao vivo de hoje. Para vocês que acompanharam de casa, do escritório, enfim, pela internet, fica o convite então para amanhã às 3h30 da tarde, a palestra de encerramento com o professor Peter Bishop. Nosso intervalo aqui para quem está participando do workshop vai até às 10h30 da manhã. Fiquem à vontade aí para aproveitar o Instituto. Obrigada pela atenção.